Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 118, Round 3, Part 3. Izuku sat in the waiting room, bouncing his legs incessantly. He was going to fight Chikachan. That was fine. He had fought Kachan before and won, so it was fine. He wouldn't even have his support gear this time. This was going to be so easy. So easy and simple and fine, and he wasn't freaking out in the slightest. He was going to fight Kachan, who he had been one step ahead of during the whole festival, who was surely very angry about being one step behind Izuku during the whole festival. Kachan, who had far more to prove now than he did during the battle trials. He was so screwed. Even if he won, he was toast. Kachan wouldn't let bygones be bygones. He'd followed him after school to beat the crap out of him before, and he'd do it again. Should he throw the match? No. All Might would be so disappointed. Why did his last two matches have to have so many pyrotechnics? He's not sure he could get through this fight without being the second person to have a flashback on live television. Hell, he could hardly get through heroics class without having a flashback. And now billions of people were going to be watching him, and All Might was going to be watching him, and he couldn't disappoint All Might any more than he already had today. For goodness sake, he was damn near having a panic attack, and he hadn't even left the waiting room yet. He was going to destroy Deku. Screw all restraint. Screw holding back. He was going to win. Recovery Girl was on standby anyway. Crappy Deku could walk it off. He had been in third place all day. And now he was only in second because Deku had taken Icy Hot out on his own. So that hardly counted. Where the hell did Deku learn to fight like that? That rematch was quirkless. He could have kicked Katsuki's ass if he had wanted to, or at least he could have tried. For how long now? Why did he just stand there and take it all those years? Why was he always looking down on him? What was he trying to prove? That crappy nerd didn't make any damn sense. But that didn't matter. He didn't need to make sense for Katsuki to kick his ass. As he sat in the waiting room, he realized that for the first time today, he was nervous. Freaking Deku, of all people, is the first match that made him nervous? God, that pissed him off. Krabby Deku and his stupid freaking super quirk. Well, the joke's on him. The nerves only made his hands sweat more. And the more sweat he had, the bigger the explosions he could make. He had half a mind to put Icy Hot's crappy thermal explosion to shame, but he wasn't confident he wouldn't end up breaking a wrist if he tried that. Plus, it was overkill. He had more control over his quirk than that idiot anyway. He was just about ready to tear his hair out when he was finally called from that damn room. He walked ahead of the guy who was supposed to be guiding him to the field and telling him when to go out, as if he hadn't done this 3 times already. He wasn't stupid. He waited in the tunnel as Deku was called out first from the other side of the arena and walked out when Loudmouth introduced him for the 4th time today, ignoring any cue the coordinator may or may not have given him. Deku stood on the other side of the pitch. His hands were bunched into fists at his sides, but Katsuki could tell they were shaking, even from this distance. He looked like a toddler gearing up for a tantrum. What a loser. Why had he been so nervous? Deku was shaking in his boots, as he should, because Katsuki was going to destroy him. The timer ticked down, and the buzzer sounded. Katsuki wasted no time charging forward, and Deku just stood there, like a deer in headlights. It only lasted a split second, but Katsuki saw it. Once he was within range, he braced his footing, held out both palms, and let off an explosion big enough to shake the stands. He expected Deku to be a pancake on the far wall of the arena, but a kick to the back told him that this fight wasn't going to be that easy. How did he get back there? Katsuki hardly blinked, and all of a sudden, he had to roll back up to his feet. Green sparks crackled across Deku's skin, and not for the first time today, Katsuki cursed that stupid freaking miracle quirk. It seemed to boost both his strength and speed to a degree that Katsuki did not know the bounds of. That overpowered runt wasn't going to get the better of him, though. Undeterred, he sent another explosion after him, this one smaller, but from a much closer range. Deku dodged it again and tried to get in close. Why the heck would he be trying to fight at close range? If he could break Half and Half's little ice palace from the other side of the arena, then why wouldn't he do the same thing against Katsuki? That kick to the back hadn't felt good, but it didn't feel any more powerful than a normal kick would. Was Deku trying to win this half-ass? He'd spent damn near 20 minutes taunting Icy Hot to get his head in the game, and now he was going to turn around and do the same thing to Katsuki? Hell no. Katsuki wasn't going to take that. As Deku came at him, he poised himself to send a blast off on him, but waited until he dodged again. Fool me once, fool me twice. Third time wasn't going to happen. Katsuki watched and raised his other hand to the left, where Deku was dodging away from a blow that never came. He could see on the nerd's face that he realized his mistake too late, and Katsuki set off an explosion big enough to send Deku flying backward. He had gotten his arms up in time to take the brunt of the damage and rolled back up onto his feet before the smoke had even cleared. He charged back toward Katsuki again, and again, Katsuki set off an explosion, forcing him to dodge out of the way in a flash of green sparks. Was he just going to use that damn quirk to run away? He'd blame his annoyance for letting Deku get close enough to land a hit on him, but in reality, he's not sure there's much he could have done to avoid it. Deku grabbed his wrist as he went to blow him away and tried to pin his arm behind his back. The same crappy move he pulled on Icy Hot to win last round, but he wasn't Icy Hot, and this fight wasn't quirkless. Deku had one of his wrists twisted awkwardly against his back and the other one in a vice grip. He was doing his best to keep Katsuki's palms facing away from him, but it wasn't enough. It hurt to wrench his wrist around, but he did it anyway and let an explosion off that shot Deku away from him. He turned around immediately so that Deku wouldn't get the chance to retaliate, but the sight that greeted him made his blood go cold. Deku was on the ground, several feet back from where he had just been. One of his hands was planted on the ground behind him, propping him up in a seated position, but the other one was shaking and pulled to his chest. His chest, which had an ugly scorch mark burnt through his shirt and onto the skin beneath it. He wasn't sure if it was reality or the memory of burnt flesh that filled his nostrils, but either way, it was enough to make him sick. The longer Deku sat there shaking, the more Katsuki's vision started to go fuzzy. Why wasn't anyone helping? He was hurt, wasn't he? How long had it been? Why wasn't Deku moving? Why wasn't he moving? Why was it so difficult to breathe? Why wasn't anyone helping? He thought he had kept his eyes on Deku, but apparently he hadn't, because all of a sudden he was standing in front of him and planting a heavy kick to his chest. The world felt like it was moving in slow motion. Everything was blurred and staticky, and he was on the ground, and he couldn't get any damn air in his stupid damn lungs. Feeling vulnerable and unable to breathe was not bringing up pleasant memories either. Gosh, this had to stop. Jeez. Screw this had to stop. Deku was after him again. Green lightning traced lines over his skin, and Katsuki needed to get up. He needed to fight. Lack of air in his lungs be damned. He needed to get a hold of himself. He was fine. Deku was fine. They were in the middle of the finals. Now was not the time to be showing weakness. As the explosion shot him back, he hardly registered the pain he was feeling. His mind was too busy supplying him the pain he had felt years ago when Kachan had done this the first time. He felt the agony of dousing the open wound in alcohol. He felt the awful pull of his charred skin that had plagued him each time he raised his arms above his head for months. He felt the horrible freezing cold and burning hot exhaustion that had smothered him for a week before he could move properly again. He felt the damp air of the stairwell fill his lungs with each painful breath, and he felt white hot fury pumping through his veins. Katsuki was not going to do that to him, not again, not without paying for it. All of his panic couldn't have been going on longer than a second because the crowd was still roaring and the teachers were still watching. No one had stepped in yet, and they didn't need to. He got to his feet quickly, but Kachan didn't move an inch. He was still looking at the ground where Izuku had sprawled out. He clearly wasn't seeing what was going on in front of him. He should give him a second to get his wits about him, shouldn't he? No. He wasn't Deku right now. He needed to fight. He could tell that Kachan's breaths were shallow, but that didn't matter. He charged forward and planted the sole of his foot onto his opponent's sternum with enough force to knock the limited air he had been forcing into his lungs out in a big huff. Kachan fell to the ground and finally looked up at him like he was actually seeing him, while he tried desperately to get air into his lungs. He looked terrified. Izuku wanted to kick him again, and man, that was sickening. What the hell was his problem? What was he doing? He couldn't kick someone while they were down. Well, he could, but he shouldn't. He wouldn't be any better than all the people who had kicked him down and kept hitting him his whole life. He couldn't be like that. He refused to be like that. Even still, anger thrummed violently under his skin. Green sparks danced across his vision, but he didn't move. Not yet. He waited until Kachan looked up at him, clutching a hand uselessly at the fabric of his own shirt as he forced in a breath. He waited until the fear in his eyes faded back to anger, and then he charged. As Izuku advanced, he watched Kachan raise a hand to him and let off an explosion. With his momentum, he dodged up and over him and rolled back onto his feet. Kachan had used another explosion to get himself back onto his feet, while Izuku's back was to it, and he was already gunning straight for him. The scent of nitroglycerin hung in the air, heavy and sweet. It was familiar, and it had only been getting worse as the fight went on. He'd been fighting with himself to retain his composure just as much as he had been fighting Kachan. Memory was most heavily linked with the sense of smell, and the scent of burnt caramel was woven into far too many memories, where the only way he could survive Kachan was to submit to his demands. Half of him was furious. Half of him wanted to pummel Katsuki into the ground, but the other half was 10 years old and terrified. There was something both halves could agree on, though. This fight needed to be over. He could feel himself shaking from head to toe. Whether it was from anger or fear, he couldn't tell, but that didn't matter. One for All crackled around him, and the second Kachan left an opening, he took it. He went low, ducked under an explosion, and kicked Kachan in the stomach with more force than he had ever used against another human being. The impact sent him flying backward and rolling for several yards. When he came to a stop on his back, he let out a groan of pain. He clutched at his stomach, but he didn't get up. Not yet, at least. Izuku knew better than to let him get up. He silenced the part of himself that told him to run away and charged toward Kachan. He didn't want to hurt him any more than necessary, and they were so close to the boundary line. All he had to do was push him out of bounds. He was still on the ground and recovering from the hit to his gut when Izuku grabbed him by the arm and hauled him up. He was still disoriented, but he had gotten his wits about him enough to start fighting back. He was setting off explosions, but Izuku just ignored them. The pain registered, but it was distant at best. Izuku threw him toward the boundary line, and Kachan let a blast behind himself to stay in bounds. Unfortunately for Kachan, he had expected that. With one hand still posed behind himself and the other hanging limp at his side, he flew forward toward Izuku with no means to dodge before it was too late. With sick satisfaction, Izuku sent a right hook straight for his jaw, hard enough for him to stumble backward. With him already off balance, it was all too easy to shove him over the line and out of bounds. Mike announcing him as the victor was nothing but static in his ears as he watched Kachan trip and fall into the grass. The better part of him told him he should help him back to his feet, but a smarter part of him told him that that wouldn't end well. Medbots were already zipping out onto the field anyway. His ears were ringing, and the panic that had been thrumming in his veins was starting to become unbearable now that he had nothing else to focus on. He noticed that he was still shaking, and taking note of his body clued him into the pain he had been ignoring. He regretted looking down at his chest immediately. His shirt was in tatters, and the skin beneath was angry, red, and burned. The pain was good, though. It meant that he hadn't been burned as badly as last time. However, the sight of the wound still made his head spin. Medbot swarmed him for the second time today, and this time he didn't bother trying to dismiss them. He just sat down on the stretcher, letting his legs give out from under him with a heavy thud. Bakugo's injuries weren't very severe. He had a dislocated shoulder, a handful of heavy bruises developing, a sprained wrist, and a mild concussion. Chio had been watching the final. Midoriya had much more restraint than his opponent. She made quick work of healing Bakugo's injuries because Midoriya was going to take much longer to see to. Bakugo didn't say a word unless prompted while she tended to him. He just grit his teeth and let out a pained grunt when she set his shoulder. From what little she knew of him, she hadn't expected him to take a loss with pride, so she wasn't too surprised. What was a surprise was how quiet Midoriya was as well. He did tend to have his moments where he seemed too shy to talk, but right now he was damn near catatonic. When she walked over to him, she wasn't given the same over-the-top polite greeting she had grown accustomed to. All she got was a shaky nod of acknowledgement. The boy was sitting on the cot with his legs crossed, his arms held in front of his chest, and he was avoiding eye contact like it was the plague. She wasn't at Midoriya's bedside yet. She was halfway between the two boys, but she had a feeling that whatever had set Midoriya off was only going to get worse as she prodded at him, and he didn't need an audience for that. Bakugo-kun, would you please wait in the hall? Someone should be by shortly to collect you for the award ceremony. If anything changes, your vision goes blurry or you get dizzy, let me know, all right? The boy, to his credit, didn't argue. He just shot a glare between her and Midoriya for a moment before leaving while muttering something under his breath that she should probably be very grateful that she didn't hear. Midoriya watched him subtly as he left, tracking his movements closely out of the corner of his eye. The tension in his shoulders released microscopically when the door shut behind him. That might be something worth keeping tabs on, but for now, there were more pressing matters at hand. Midoriya-kun, she gently called his attention back to her. He gave her another jerky nod of acknowledgement as he sat there trembling. His lips were pressed into a fine line as he appeared to be chewing on them. This was worrying. She had seen to the boy after shattering his own bones several times now, and he had never been quite so demure. Either he was much more injured than he was letting on, or there was something else at play here. She wasn't looking forward to whichever outcome awaited her. I'm going to need you to move your arms so I can tend to your burns, Chio warned. Whatever minuscule amount of tension that had released from his shoulders when Bakugo left returned with a vengeance at her words. Still, he listened. He moved his arms shakily to his sides, as if he were fighting against them to follow her directions. The burns didn't look awful, but they were quite expansive, covering the majority of the boy's chest and arms. His shirt was little more than clumps of scorched cloth strung together around his torso, but it still needed to be removed so that she could see what she was doing. I'm going to have to cut your shirt off, dearie, she cautioned. The surprisingly steady breaths Midoriya had been taking stopped abruptly, and his arms twitched as if they were going to shield his chest again before remembering that she had requested he move them. He refused to look up at her as he nodded again and started taking in breaths that were far too quick and shallow to be of much use. Chio wished she could give the boy time to collect himself, but his physical health came first. It would probably be better to get this over with anyway. She grabbed a pair of scissors and started snipping away the few points of connection that held the shirt in place. By the time the poor excuse for a garment was removed, Midoriya's breath had returned to normal. The tension had left his shoulders almost completely, but his expression was blank, and he was looking off into nothing. The lights were on, but it appeared as if no one was home. That that wasn't good at all, but it would probably make this process much less painful for the poor kid. Judging by the state of his shirt, his back shouldn't be too damaged, but she went to check it over before she guided him to lay down. As she inspected it, she saw a large swath of discolored flesh on the far side of the boy's torso. The skin was raised and textured, darker in some places and bright silvery white in others. It appeared to be scar tissue from a burn that wrapped around his side and onto his chest. She quickly shuffled around the bed to get a better look at it before she had him lie down. The expanse of the scarring was much worse than it had looked from the other side of the cot. It went down, starting from the bottom of his cervical vertebrae, over his shoulder, and across the entirety of his right side before disappearing into the waistline of his pants. It looked old and poorly healed. She could imagine it had been extremely painful, and she shuddered to think what could have caused it. Whatever happened to the boy was likely contributing to his current state of mind, but that wasn't what she needed to be focusing on right now. Shaking the thoughts from her head, she gently pushed the boy's shoulders down until he rested on his back. He moved like putty, following her directions without a lick of defiance as he stared up at the ceiling unblinkingly. There were many more concerning scars littering the boy's front, but she ignored them as best she could and went about treating the burns across his chest. She cleaned them, and Midoriya didn't so much as flinch as she did. The burns were all manageable, second degree. They shouldn't scar too badly, if at all, assuming they were taken care of properly, and she was going to see to it personally that they were taken care of properly. A body this young shouldn't be so marred. She called to one of her aides to grab another long-sleeved shirt to replace the one Midoriya had been wearing as she bandaged him up behind a privacy screen. She would have to report all of this, but given the boy's normal attire, she assumed he would prefer that the fewer people who saw his scars, the better. With his shirt in place, she grabbed an ice cube and a towel, placing the former in the boy's hand and the latter around it in an attempt to bring him back to coherency as painlessly as possible. It took about at least 20 minutes, and two completely melted ice cubes before any amount of focus returned to his eyes. But Chio had ordered her aides not to let anyone in, barring a world-ending catastrophe, and she had enough patience to wait. When Midoriya looked over to her, she gave a gentle smile and waited a little longer before speaking. Is there anything or anyone I could get for you, dearie? She asked quietly. The boy looked at her for longer than most would take to understand a question before he shook his head. All right, I'll be right here if you need anything, she offered, turning around in her chair and busying herself at her desk. He needed time to get back to himself, and she was going to give him as much as he needed. Award ceremony be damned. Katsuki sat fuming under the arena in his stupid frickin' second place pedestal next to the stupid frickin' icy hot bastard for what felt like hours before Deku walked into the room. He had gotten a new shirt. Katsuki could see white bandages wrapped around his right hand and up his wrist before they disappeared behind the hem of his sleeve. He looked like the scared, useless null he had been in junior high. Katsuki hadn't noticed how much taller he'd been standing lately until he slouched back into the weak, pathetic posture he had carried himself with for most of his life. Was he seriously going to get up on his first place pedestal looking so damn pathetic? Stand up, you crappy nerd, he barked as Deku stood on his marker. He jumped as Katsuki spoke, but that reaction didn't give him the satisfaction that it used to. It just made him angrier. You're not going up there looking so damn pathetic. Stand up! He shouted again. This time, Deku took a full step back away from him and stared at him with wide eyes before taking in a breath, shaking his head and complying. He turned away from Katsuki, faced forward, straightened his spine, and squared his shoulders. His expression was still eerily neutral, but it was better than what it had been. Less than a minute later, the ceiling above them opened up and the light of the late afternoon sun poured in, making him squint for a moment before the podium started to rise. Half and half went up first, then him, and finally Deku's platform rose up between them. He glanced over to make sure he hadn't dropped his shoulders again, and the guy had an ear-to-ear smile on his face. The crowd roared in approval, and that bastard seemed to soak it up like a sponge, except the smile didn't really reach his eyes, and his hands still held on to a persistent tremor. Katsuki watched him out of the corner of his eye. He stood there and only half paid attention as the teachers worked together to botch All Might's entrance. But the crowd roared even louder regardless, and Katsuki didn't bother trying to hide his annoyance. He didn't want to be here. There was no reason him and frickin' Icy Hot should be on the podium. They were being celebrated for losing, and it was frickin' embarrassing. The crowd screamed in celebration as All Might rested the third place medal around Half and Half's neck and gave him a bear hug. Oh, hell no. He was not doing that to Katsuki. He didn't care if it was All Might or God himself. He wasn't going to let himself look like a weak little baby getting a hug from their idol. When All Might walked over with his medal, Katsuki didn't bow his head so that he could put it on. He just held out his hand to take it. When All Might faltered at Katsuki flipping the script, he just reached out and took it himself. This whole show had stretched on long enough, and he wasn't going to wait for All Might's brain to load. He shoved the medal in his pocket and reluctantly accepted the handshake that All Might offered instead of a hug. When All Might shifted his attention to Deku, Katsuki watched in disgust as both of them wore smiles bright enough to blind anyone watching. All Might settled the first place medal on his shoulders and hugged Deku tight enough that Katsuki heard several things crack. What the hell was their deal? They seemed far too familiar since day one, and it had only gotten worse since the USJ. It was difficult to make out over the noise of the crowd losing it, but Katsuki could swear he heard All Might say, "I'm so proud of you, my boy." My boy? Who the hell was he calling my boy? Deku had some explaining to do about several things already, and they just seemed to keep piling up. An eon later, the teachers finally wrapped up the stupid ceremony, and the podium started to lower the three of them back down to the room they had been in before. The moment the noise of the crowd was shut out behind them, Deku crumpled like a wet paper towel. His shoulders dropped and his expression went back to the same sad, scared, and submissive thing it had been since they were kids. At least he had the decency to not look so pathetic out there. Half and Half kept looking at him with a furrowed brow like he was trying to figure out what the hell his problem was, but Deku skittered away to the locker rooms like a rat before he could. He looked over to Katsuki like he might have an answer, but he just rolled his eyes and shouldered past him. He had no clue what Deku's deal was, and even if he did, he wasn't going to try to explain it to someone as socially stunted as him. By the time he got to the locker room, Deku had already shut himself into a bathroom stall to change, like he always did. He'd done it since they were little, and Katsuki never understood it. He was just drawing more attention to himself, sneaking away like that. By the time he had packed up his bag, the rest of the class was starting to come in from the stands, and Deku was trying to slip out unnoticed. He just got first place in the sports festival. The idiot wasn't going to go unnoticed anywhere for a while. Deku brushed everyone off as quickly as he could, and then the crowd turned on him. Shitty Hair tried to congratulate him, but he ignored everyone and marched out after Deku. That nerd had some explaining to do, and he wasn't going to get away so easily, not this time. Even with how fast he'd followed, Deku was already halfway down the block outside the front gates by the time he caught up to him. He had his hood up and his head down. Maybe the dumbass realized people were going to recognize him now. Deku! He shouted ahead of him as the crappy nerd walked away. He saw his shoulders tense and his step falter mid-stride. He took one more step before his shoulders rose, like he was taking a deep breath, and he turned around. His expression didn't betray anything. He just looked back at Katsuki and waited. When the hell did you learn how to fight? He asked without preamble. Deku glanced around them before answering, but his expression didn't change. Been training since I was 12, he replied, not quite meeting Katsuki's gaze. 12? It had been over 3 years? He could have fought back, or at least tried to. For over 3 years? What the hell was he getting out of playing the victim? Why did he just fold over like a bitch and take it? Did he think everyone was so beneath him that he didn't even bother to try? And why the hell was he still shaking in front of Katsuki like he was scared? So what, you were just pretending to be pathetic? You're always looking down on me. What the hell is your problem? He demanded. Deku flinched back from his volume, but that only pissed him off more. I never looked down on you, Kachan, Deku tried to deny. Oh, piss off. You could have fought back the whole time with that damn quirk. Why did you hide it? You were pretending to be a null for what? Pity? To make me look like an idiot? I wasn't pretending anything. I didn't have a quirk until 5 months ago. It would have shattered my bones if I'd gotten it. Bullshit! You owe me a real damn explanation, Katsuki insisted. Deku's expression finally shifted from the tired, neutral, empty thing it had been since the award ceremony ended, but what it changed to was something Katsuki had never seen on his face. Anger. He'd seen him annoyed. He'd seen him indignant. He'd seen him fed up. He'd never seen such fury on his face. Midoriya! A voice from behind called him. The expression disappeared in the blink of an eye. There you are! I was looking all over for you, Pink Cheeks said after jogging over. She shot a glare back at Katsuki, draped an arm over Deku's shoulders, and started guiding him away without a word. Whatever. Deku couldn't run away forever. He was going to get an explanation sooner or later, whether that a-hole wanted to give it to him or not. He walked straight and took a different path to the train station, one that would hopefully not put him on the same train as Deku and Pink Cheeks. The silver medal in his pocket felt like it weighed 20 pounds, and he had half a mind to throw it over the side of the bridge he was currently crossing. But he knew he'd never hear the end of it from the hag if he did that. Frickin' hell. He was never going to hear the end of it from her anyway. But coming home empty handed was only going to make it worse. So he just kept walking. End of chapter.